It started with a sound I'd never heard before, a hollow clunk in the pipes. I remember standing there in the kitchen, half awake, holding my mug under the faucet like I did every morning, waiting for that steady hum of water. But it sputtered once, twice, and then nothing, just air, just silence. For a few seconds I thought maybe a fuse blew or the pump tripped. I built that system myself 15 years ago. Every bolt, every line, so if something went wrong, it was on me. But when I checked the valves, everything was fine. The pressure gauge sat dead. I had that strange feeling you get when something ordinary, something you count on without thinking, just stops working. I stepped outside, coffee cup still in hand, and that's when I saw it. A laminated notice duct-taped right to my doorframe. Bright red letters screaming immediate compliance required. Below it, a fine for $34,000 for landscape violations and non-standard fencing. I laughed out loud. I didn't even have a fence on that side of the property. And my landscaping was all native, low-water flora approved by the county's own drought program. I designed it myself to conserve water long before the HOA even existed. So yeah, I laughed. Right until I heard a man's voice behind me say, "Sir, we've disconnected your water due to unpaid fees." I turned, and there he was, mid-40s, polo shirt, clipboard, HOA logo on the van parked behind him. "You've done what?" I asked. He looked me dead in the eye, said, "Water service suspended per board directive." That's when it hit me. This wasn't a utility issue. This was them. Now, to be clear, I don't live in some cookie-cutter suburb. My property sits right at the edge of a community called Crestwood Estates. When I bought it, it was still unincorporated land, a patch of dry basin nobody wanted. I hired a crew, pulled permits, drilled down into one of the cleanest aquifers in the region, and built a private well. I maintain it, test it, pay taxes on it. I don't owe the HOA a drop. So when that man said, "We shut off your water," I couldn't help but smile, the kind of smile that's not really a smile. "You can't shut off something you don't own," I told him. He gave that look bureaucrats give when they realize you're not bluffing. "Sir, the HOA owns the infrastructure," he said, half confident, half confused. I stepped closer, pointed at the ridge. "That pump house over there? That's my well. I drilled it. I paid for it. You shut off a pipe that doesn't belong to you." He blinked, mumbled something about following orders, and drove off. That was my first confirmation it wasn't incompetence. It was control. I went back inside, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old yellow folder labeled Well Permits and Rights. Inside were copies of everything: county approvals, geological surveys, notarized deeds. I'd kept them all for a reason, because I've worked long enough around bureaucracies to know the only defense against power is paper. My daughter Emma was still asleep upstairs. She's 12, homeschooled, sharp as a tack. Her mother used to say she had a spark that could cut through stone. I didn't want her waking up to chaos, so I stayed quiet. But inside I was burning, because I knew who was behind this: Margaret Crowell, HOA president, power blazer, pearl earrings, the self-appointed sheriff of suburbia. She moved into Crestwood about 4 years back and turned the place into her personal fiefdom. Overnight, we went from a community to a kingdom, hers. I'd crossed her once, maybe twice, over some ridiculous rule about porch light color and mailbox size. I didn't think much of it back then. But when you stand your ground in front of people like her, they remember. By noon, 3 more violation notices were jammed into my mailbox, each one dumber than the last. Grass too tall, I had gravel. Unapproved window curtains, my daughter's glow-in-the-dark stars, and visible non-standard equipment, referring to my generator. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was war, so I got methodical. Took photos of everything, time-stamped, GPS tagged, uploaded to the cloud. Then I sent the HOA a cease and desist letter, citing unlawful interference with private utilities under state code. I copied the city, the county, and just for fun, the local water district. Then I called someone who owed me a favor. Carla Ruiz, detective, old friend, godmother to my kid. Years ago, I helped her get out of her own HOA nightmare when her board tried to fine her for a drainage easement that turned out to be public land. She checked the city records for me, and 2 hours later she texted back, "No record of HOA jurisdiction. They're bluffing, and that was all I needed." See, before I retired, I was a consultant. Geological infrastructure, land use, water rights. I've been in more hearings and zoning disputes than most lawyers. I know how people like Margaret play. They don't beat you with law, they beat you with exhaustion. They drown you in paperwork and hope you'll fold. But I wasn't folding. 2 days later, after Emma asked why her shower still didn't work, I decided it was time to make a point. That night, under a half-moon sky, I went out to the east side of my land where the HOA's unauthorized line tapped into my well system. Years ago, I'd built a manual override valve there, just in case someone got clever. I opened the vault, turned the valve, and within 30 seconds, the entire neighborhood went dry. By morning, panic had spread like wildfire. Sprinklers hissed empty. Pools stopped filling. Lawns browned by the hour. HOA board members raced around in golf carts waving clipboards like flags of surrender. They had no idea what had happened because they never cared to learn how the system actually worked. I sat on my porch with my coffee, brewed from stored reserves, and watched the show unfold. They sent out bulletins calling it a municipal pressure issue. They blamed the city. The irony? There's no city water line in Crestwood, not one. Every drop came from my well. 48 hours later, I sent an open letter to every resident, certified mail and email both. To the residents of Crestwood Estates, your water service has been disrupted not by city failure, but by HOA interference with private property. The well that supplies your home sits on my land, under my permit, and was illegally tampered with. Until this is acknowledged and rectified, the system will remain closed. This isn't revenge, it's respect. Signed, Jack Halpern, Parcel 1 and 13. Within hours, my phone blew up. Some angry, some supportive, most confused. I didn't respond. I let the silence do the talking. Because silence, I've learned, is pressure, and pressure eventually breaks something. On day 3, a city engineer showed up at my door. Nice guy. Name was Luis Moreno. Civil Infrastructure Office. Said he'd been sent to clarify jurisdiction. I handed him the folder I'd kept since day 1. Permits, photos, even the capped valve they installed. He flipped through it slowly, whistled low, and said, "They really thought this was communal?" "Pretended," I corrected, "until it suited them to punish me with it." He nodded. "You've got everything you need." They're in trouble, and he was right. That afternoon, a local news truck parked across from the clubhouse. Neighbors started whispering. HOA credibility cracked faster than dry clay. But Margaret, she wasn't done. She doubled down, sent her landscape crew to my fence line to inspect the junction. I caught them on camera, bolt cutters in hand, trying to pry open my utility box. I stepped outside, calm but loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You're trespassing," I said. "And if you cut that seal, you're committing a felony." They froze, packed up, and left without a word. 10 minutes later, I got a voicemail from the HOA treasurer. Robert Dean, nervous tone, trying to sound diplomatic. "Hey, Jack, listen. We'd like to resolve this quietly. Margaret's open to some kind of compensation for the water use. Maybe a shared system agreement." I didn't even reply. You don't negotiate with people who steal from you and call it a misunderstanding. That night, I uploaded everything, photos, legal documents, recordings, to a public folder titled Crestwood HOA Water Theft Evidence Archive, and shared it with every resident. The next morning, the truth was everywhere. Flyers, group chats, door-to-door gossip. People who'd been silent for years were suddenly awake. Turns out, I wasn't the only one Margaret had stepped on. By noon, she called an emergency community meeting. I wasn't invited, but that didn't matter. Half the neighborhood showed up waving printed copies of my evidence. A friend texted me updates from the back row. "She's trying to blame you. People aren't buying it. Robert just said they acted under assumptions. Someone asked if you'd speak. She called you unstable. 3 people walked out. That was when I knew the tide had turned. Still, Margaret wasn't the type to surrender. 2 days later, I got a letter from her attorney. Cease and desist, demanding I restore shared water service or face legal action for community harm. I actually laughed reading it, because right next to it on my desk was a copy of my well deed, stamped and sealed, showing full ownership of all subsurface rights. So I called a lawyer of my own. His name was Howard Lane, soft-spoken guy, Looked like he'd been cross-examining city planners since the 80s. I told him everything, sent him every file. Within 24 hours, he fired back a formal counterclaim for trespass, theft, and environmental negligence. And the kicker? He found a document from 2011, a developer's draft showing a proposed easement on my property line marked pending review. It was never finalized, never recorded. The HOA had built their entire claim on a ghost. Howard attached a notarized statement from the original city planner, confirming the easement had been voided a decade ago. His summary letter was brutal. My client's property was accessed without consent based on a non-existent easement. The HOA's actions constitute unlawful interference with private infrastructure. They didn't respond. Not right away. Instead, Margaret tried to rally her followers online, flooded the community app with posts about one man holding hundreds hostage, but the comments turned against her. Residents started posting their own stories, fines for flagpoles, letters about sidewalk chalk, threats over mailbox colors. The dam had broken, and for once not the kind she could control. By the end of the week, city enforcement trucks rolled in, marked Civil Infrastructure Division. They followed the HOA's illegal pipe straight onto my land, verified the unauthorized tap, and issued a written order. Remove all connections within 7 days or face fines and criminal referral. That same afternoon, a letter arrived at my door, handwritten, shaky. Jack, let's be adults. No more escalation. We can work this out gracefully. Maybe a shared use agreement, some compensation. No lawyers, no drama. MC, I folded it up, slid it into my file, and smiled. That's when I knew it was over. The next morning, Crestwood felt like a ghost town. The air was dry, the lawns gone brittle. Sprinklers hissed dust. But for the first time in years, I could walk down the street without hearing anyone complain about grass height or mailbox color. People were too busy realizing what had really been going on. Then something remarkable happened. My driveway turned into a gathering place. First it was Jen from 2 houses down, carrying a couple of milk jugs asking if she could borrow some water for her kids. Then another neighbor showed up, and another. Within an hour there was a line of families with buckets and drums, embarrassed but polite, angry at the HOA, not me. So I rigged a spigot off my backup line, slow flow but clean water, and let it run. Folks came and went, and for the first time since moving here, people actually talked to one another. Some apologized for believing the rumors. Some just thanked me quietly. One man looked at me and said, "You really built that well yourself." I nodded. He shook his head almost in disbelief. "Guess we've been drinking your water all these years and never knew it." Word spread faster than any bulletin Margaret could post. By the weekend, someone had taped flyers to mailboxes. The HOA doesn't own your water. Jack Halpern does, and they shut him off first. There was a link to my evidence archive. That flyer was the crack that split the dam wide open. On Monday morning, 2 city sedans rolled up. Luis Moreno was back, this time with a woman named Rebecca Chang, Environmental Compliance Division. She carried herself like someone used to depositions, not meetings. They walked the whole network, taking photos, marking pipes, muttering under their breath. I followed quietly, half amused, half curious. At the old junction, Rebecca crouched down, ran her fingers along the capped line and said, "Unauthorized connection. No permit. No recorded easement." Then she looked up at Luis. "This isn't just a zoning violation. This is theft." I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. That afternoon, Robert, the treasurer, called again, voice lower than usual. "Off the record," he said. "Margaret wants to negotiate privately. She's willing to drop all the fines, even pay for usage." I said nothing for a long time. Then finally, "Robert, it's not about money. It's about respect. Tell her that." And I hung up. 2 days later, I walked into their emergency HOA meeting uninvited. 30 people sat in folding chairs, the air thick with tension. Margaret stood at the front, red blazer crisp as ever. A slideshow behind her titled Water Crisis, Path to Resolution. She started with that politician's tone. Soft, rehearsed, detached. As many of you know, recent misunderstandings have created division in our community. I let her talk for about 10 minutes before I stood. "You don't own the water," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. Heads turned. Margaret froze mid-sentence. I walked to the aisle, holding up a folder. This, I said, is every legal document proving that well is private property, built before this HOA even existed. You trespassed. You capped my line. You lied to every person in this room. She tried to cut me off, but Robert stood up beside her. He's right, he said quietly. The room shifted. You could feel it. He stepped forward, holding his own folder. I reviewed his deed with the city engineers. The HOA had no authority. We acted outside our rights. Margaret turned red. Robert, you're out of line. No, he said, louder now. I'm finally in one. The room broke into murmurs. A woman in the back called out, You fined me for a flagpole. Someone else shouted, You threatened to sue me over a swing set. And just like that, years of frustration poured out. It wasn't just me anymore. It was everyone she'd ever tried to control. Margaret slammed her binder shut, voice shaking. I have preserved property values, maintained order, defended this community. I looked at her calm. You nearly started a public health crisis over a personal grudge. The silence that followed was heavy, real. Then Mr. Goldstein, an old man who'd lived there longer than anyone, stood up and said, I move to vote for her removal. The second came before she could speak. The third came with applause. The final count wasn't even close. Margaret was removed by a margin of 72-4. I didn't celebrate. I just stood there as she gathered her papers, walked past me without a word, and stepped out into the parking lot. Her red blazer caught the sunlight for one last flash, then disappeared around the corner. 2 days later, the city held an official hearing to close the case. Rebecca led it herself, formal, procedural, but you could feel the weight of it. On one side of the table sat me and my lawyer. On the other, Margaret, Robert, and some frazzled HOA attorney who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Rebecca asked me to state my claim for the record, so I told it straight. How I built the well, how they tapped into it, how they shut off my water to punish me, and how I shut theirs off to make them see. Then she turned to Margaret. Is it true you acted based on an unfiled easement? Margaret hesitated. It was assumed to be valid. Rebecca leaned back. Assumed. Not verified. Correct. Then let the record show, Rebecca said, that the Crestwood HOA accessed a private water source without legal authority or municipal permit. They violated environmental code and county utility statutes. Fines will be issued. Unauthorized lines must be dismantled within 14 days. The room went dead quiet. Rebecca looked at me, her tone softer. Mr. Halpern, you were within your rights to close access. The city commends your documentation and restraint. I just nodded. Emma squeezed my hand under the table. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Outside, the air was hot and bright. Margaret left before the stenographer could even pack up. She didn't look angry anymore, just small. Deflated. The following weekend, Crestwood held a special election. Over 70% of residents signed a petition to dissolve the board and rebuild from scratch. The vote took place on a Saturday morning. Tables, ballots, neighbors chatting like old friends. I brought Emma with me, let her drop the ballot in the box. Are we firing her today? She whispered. I smiled. We're fixing what she broke. When the results came in, it wasn't even close. The board was dissolved. A new community council was formed. One representative from each street, decisions made in public, meetings recorded and posted online. They asked me to help draft the new charter. I agreed, under one condition, that they include a clause forbidding any HOA from ever interfering with private utilities again. They called it the Halpern provision. Weeks passed. The lawns regrew, the tension faded. People started living again. Kids rode bikes down the street. Neighbors waved without suspicion. And every morning, when I heard the steady hum of that pump under my floorboards, it sounded less like machinery and more like a heartbeat. A reminder that freedom, once defended, never sounds the same again. One afternoon, Emma sat by the well housing, sketching birds in her notebook. Dad, she said, I think I want to study environmental law. I laughed softly. Why's that? She shrugged. You took on the system and didn't flinch. I want to do that, but from the start, before it gets bad. I looked at her for a long moment. realizing how much of me she'd absorbed just by watching. "You'd be good at it," I said. "Better than me," she smiled. "Had a good teacher." That night, as I walked the property line, I stopped by the spot where the HOA's illegal pipe once lay buried. Now it's just clean dirt and a marker we placed there, engraved with the words "Private Well," protected by community trust. It wasn't vanity. It was a reminder that control without consent is abuse and silence can be mistaken for surrender. But when a single person stands up and says no more, the quiet can turn into something powerful. 6 months later, a city inspector stopped by, asked if I'd consider letting them use my well as a model for sustainable residential development, teaching other communities how to build resilience instead of dependency. I said I'd think about it. Truth is, I already knew my answer. Because this whole ordeal taught me something I wish I'd known sooner, that power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it carries a clipboard and a smile, but it's still power, and the only thing that keeps it honest is people who remember what's theirs. So yeah, the HOA tried to use water as a weapon, but I turned it into proof. Proof that one man, standing firm, can hold back a tide of control with nothing more than a locked valve, a stack of paperwork, and the truth. And when that pressure finally broke, it didn't drown anyone. Just washed the lies clean and set a whole neighborhood free. If you were me, if someone tried to take what was yours under the name of community, would you have shut the valve too? Tell me what you think down in the comments. Do you side with the HOA or with the man who guarded the well? Because sometimes what we call order looks a whole lot like control. And sometimes it takes one stubborn neighbor to remind everyone where the water really comes from.